So I am Dr. Aija White. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Northern British Columbia. I work with Professor Dezeen Huber, who is with the Ecosystem Science and Management program. So this research was actually conceived after Climate Agriculture Initiative of BC was consulting with producers. They thought up the general area of we need to do some pollinator research in the north, so in the Bulkley-Nechako and Fraser-Fort George regional districts, because there is a really huge gap in the literature in terms of just our basic knowledge of what species are found on farms this far north. So the majority of agricultural research in this province is conducted in the Lower Mainland and the Okanagan. This area in BC produces a lot of beef that people eat farther south, and they produce a lot of the forage that cows in other parts of the province eat. It's a huge market up here. In addition to the fact that we have lots of local growers for vegetables and fruit that are really important to local economies. In recent years, we've been seeing some research coming out from areas that are more intensively developed. So I'm thinking Europe and a lot of the agricultural regions in South America that are showing that the number of pollinators and the biodiversity of pollinators on farms is falling. And so I think there was also some concern as to whether the pollinator communities up here in the Bulkley-Nechako and Fraser-Fort George regional districts on farms are also in decline. And in order to document a decline, of course, you have to have a baseline measurement. And so a big piece of what we headed out to do was to lay down that baseline and just figure out what's here right now. By the end of the report and the end of all the DNA barcoding and all that stuff, I think we had gotten to 213 likely or known pollinator species that we caught. So one of the messages that I think comes across in this work is that if you're thinking about future crops, you should be thinking now about what are my pollinators that I have on my land, or what are the pollinators that are most common on farms in my region. And this report tells you that. It tells you what are your most common pollinators. There's 5 or 6 species that we found across all sites, regardless of crop, regardless of time. They're just there all the time. Those are the ones you can count on. So if you're thinking ahead and thinking about planting something different, take a look at what you can expect there to pollinate that plant. And that's one of the big things that this report kind of lays down very clearly. The other thing is that I think for policymakers, it's starting to become apparent that forested areas near farms are pretty important for supporting pollinator populations. So anybody who's thinking about doing some changes around land use, so cutting down some trees in order to open up a field or taking out some forest for whatever reason, you may want to think twice about that. Or you may want to modify how much forest you're taking down and preserve more in fragments, because the fact is that these edge communities of pollinators are more diverse than the pollinators that you see out in the middle of fields. And also earlier in the year, so in the spring, we see pollinator biodiversity is quite a bit higher in field edges, which means that early in the season, when resources are generally quite scarce because crops haven't started blooming yet, right? It's all native plants that pollinators are relying on. Those forest edges are really important little kind of micro systems, ecosystems for pollinators that you want them there. So hanging on to forested areas and areas with kind of native flowering vegetation. We're looking to develop some resources for identifying native plants that pollinators use. We're developing some guidelines around potential targets for pollinator habitat enhancement. So what kind of native plants should you be planting if you're looking to increase pollinator biodiversity, and where can you go to get appropriate seeds, which is one of the big missing pieces. Lots of people put out pollinator enhancement guides, but it's pretty atypical to actually help people buy seeds or start. The materials that are coming out from this year's work should be a little bit more kind of quantitative and producer focused and utilitarian in general. Yeah.